Good afternoon. My name is James, and I'm here to present our speaker this afternoon. I just want you to imagine how it feels to make something. You break it, you remake it using tools of your choice. And today we will have Joshua Martins, who makes Firefox crash less often, and then he writes it all in Rust. He also sings in a barbershop quartet. And I think that is going to be very exciting to see a musician, a researcher, a scholar, a practitioner present to us. So I want to give Joshua the floor to tell us how.
Thank you very much. So I do a lot of work with open source projects like Firefox, for example, looking for ways that we can make contribution easier for people who would like to contribute to said project. So let's say you're in the position of you are a maintainer for a project. You have just released it to the world. You have heard about those many eyeballs that will make your bug shallow, and you want to take advantage of them. What do you do? Let's see. We need to think about this in two different ways. We're going to think about it from the terms of, as a maintainer, what are your responsibilities? What do you need to provide? And we're going to think about as a contributor, or someone who would like to contribute, what are the things that you are looking for? And together, this will give us a view for what we need to do for our project. So as a maintainer, you first need to think about, like, who are you actually targeting? If you're thinking about people contributing to your project, who are these people? Are they users of a library or an application you're writing? Are they just developers who are trying to gain a new skill? These are things you need to consider. Then you need to think about what is the full range of possibilities that what are the ways someone could contribute? What are the things they could work on? But also, are those things that you would like them to work on? Are there things that you would not actually like to take contributions for? That's totally acceptable. Some areas require certain domain experience, and it's okay to say, you're welcome to contribute to any of these other areas instead. And finally, as a maintainer, you need to be able to draw a boundary and say, I'm willing to provide this much help for someone to allow them to contribute to this project, but you don't have to devote all your time to this if someone does not meet a certain minimum skill set. That is an okay choice to make, but it should be a choice. Now, as a contributor, there are certain requirements in order to get involved in a new project. As a contributor, you might come to a project and you might want to know, what are the skills that I require in order to contribute to this? What are the expectations placed upon me and my work? What are the things that I can work on? What are the things that I possess the skills to work on? What are the things that are allowed for me to work on? Are there things that have deadlines? Are there things that are already assigned to other people? If these things aren't clear, then as a new contributor, it's difficult to see where you fit in. And finally, what's involved in actually sharing my work? If I do successfully make a change, then what are the steps I need to go through in order to get that out in the wider world? And also, what's very, very important is when you get stuck, how do you get help? What are the specific places you go to? What are the mechanisms used? Is it a live chat system? Is there a forum? Is there a mailing list? Is there a certain email of someone who says, yes, I want to help you? As a contributor, you need to know where to actually go to get help for these things. So our goal as a project maintainer is to take all of these things, all these ideas, and combine them. So basically, together, we are going to figure out how to help our target audience we've decided we are targeting. We're going to help them find the project. We're going to help them actually start getting involved and contributing, and do that quickly. And then we're going to try to help them have a positive experience. And we'll see how all of those things together will then establish a sort of feedback loop that will help us gain more contributors over time. So I've got a straightforward 5-point plan in order to address the second two of those points, actually. There's 3 of these, and the second 2 are actually the most important here, because it turns out if you're marketing your project far and wide, but you don't actually have systems set up to ensure the experience is positive for new contributors, you're going to have a bunch of people bouncing, and that's no good. So let's focus on the second 2 first. So we're going to go through all these steps. And we're going to start with prioritizing important information. This is key. And if you thought that you were going to walk out of here without making any changes to your documentation, you were wrong. Because let me tell you, documentation is so important. So, absolute fundamentals. Someone who comes to your project needs to know, how am I going to use this thing? Is it an application? Can I install a binary, or do I need to build it from source? How do I build it from source? What are the steps involved? What skills do I need? What technology? All of these things need to be documented. You're also going to have to tell them, like, how do you make changes? As we talked about, there are often steps you need to go through, but if these are hidden and not documented, it's going to be much harder for someone. You're going to be arbitrarily setting the bar at a certain level and saying, well, if you can't figure it out by yourself, tough luck, we don't want you. And if you're really keen on actually getting contributions from a larger pool of people, then you're going to have to go to more work in order to make that possible. And again, where can you get support? This is where you document it. This is where you bless certain communication mechanisms. If there's an IRC channel for your project, for example, then yes, you can list that. But keep in mind that for things like time zones, sometimes if all of your teammates are all in the same time zone, anyone on the opposite side of the world is going to have problems. So you should probably think about, like, what makes sense for support. Should we have an email list as well as an IRC channel? That's good as long as people are actually checking the email list. Because that's really, really bad if you say, yes, we'll support you, and people just keep sending messages to something that never gets a response. That's really disheartening. So put it in the README. The README is a de facto standard by this point. It's been around since the 80s, earlier probably, when people started using those. And it's just going to be the things that are most important for people to know off the top. So as an example, I work on a project called Servo, which is on GitHub. And this is a little screenshot of part of our README. And so it's got some of the most important bits. It's got a description of what Servo is. It's got links for where to go if you need to learn how to contribute to it. And then it's got things about, we currently develop it on these platforms. Therefore, these are the platforms you'll need if you're going to work on it. And then we have instructions for each platform for how to set it up for that platform. So it's all fairly straightforward stuff. But this is what we decided is most important for our audience. Now, next step, the more advanced stuff. Roadmaps are really useful. I said earlier, you can decide what you want people to work on, what you don't want people to work on, where you draw the line for accepting contributions. Roadmaps are a really good way of establishing that. That's where you can lay out the plan for the project. It can be at a very early stage. If you say, this is our goal, we want to get it to this point, we expect to go through sort of these stages for that, we're going to work on these features, these components. And you can also specify that certain things are a non-goal. We don't want to turn this library that currently does high performance numeric calculations into an email library. That's kind of different ballpark there. We're not going to do that. And so yeah, this is a way of setting expectations for people. And additionally, it allows potential contributors to look at your list of what you're going to be working on and give them ideas. They can say, oh, I see you're going to be adding visualization to your high performance numeric computation library. That's something I have experience in. I bet I could work on that. The other really important thing here is GitHub has its own de facto standard that it's created for files called contributing.md, which stands for Markdown, which is just a way of formatting documents. And what this means is, if you put any content in that file, then anytime someone opens up a pull request for your repository or files a new issue, there'll be a little link right above there that says, please review the guidelines for contributing to this repository. And that'll take any contributor directly to that file. And so that's really great. You can use that to specify a recommended workflow for contributing to your project. You can also list things like, what's the style guide? What things do we require from all of our contributions before we actually will allow them to merge into the main master repository? This is great. This is, again, setting expectations, documenting requirements. These are the things that people look for when they are coming to potentially contribute to a new project. So here's a screenshot of part of the contributing.md for Servo. As you can see, we start off with a welcome, inviting contributions, and then we also lay out what our requirements are for contributions. They're going to be pull requests. They're going to be reviewed. There's going to be a code review that happens. We link to ways to find things to work on. We link to another guide for specific coding-related strategies for getting involved. Then we have a list under that of things you should watch out for if you're making a pull request. Now, expert mode. Here's where it gets interesting. As a project, you can just coast along on the things we've talked about so far, but there are certain tricks that projects have discovered over time that help gain the attention of people. For example, every time you do a big release of some kind, if you have release notes that document what changed, why it's interesting, who contributed, these are great. These allow the project, or these give the project sort of a sign of life. It makes it look like it's active, it's happening, and it allows the maintainers to direct the attention of people interested in the project towards certain developments. And when I was maintaining a project back about 7 years ago or so, I found as one of two maintainers. The other guy, he wrote a lot of code. It was great. He'd occasionally make releases with zero fanfare at all. There'd suddenly be a new zip file appearing on SourceForge. When I joined, I started writing release notes every time we did one of these, and I wrote up what changed, and I saw downloads skyrocket. People would see this show up in the SourceForge newsfeed, they'd click through, they'd say, oh, I see there's now, in this game, there's now this new feature in the battle system. That's really exciting. And they'd go and try it out. Another example, for things where releases take longer between times, but you still want to keep people updated on what the project is doing, you can use a changelog. And so sometimes you might look at, when you hear changelog, you might think, oh, that's just like the commit log, right? That's just the list of precisely every change that was made. But changelogs don't have to be so literal. They can be documents that are just like progress reports of really interesting things that have happened since the last time there was a progress report. And there is a GameCube emulator. My stopwatch stopped. That's a shame. There's a GameCube emulator called Dolphin, which releases monthly progress reports, which are fantastic. They list specific features that have been fixed, games that are affected. They give a really interesting rundown on like the really challenging problems, and they talk about who was involved. They're so good for publicity. Other things that might be good for your project. So if you get lots of support questions, you might start noticing that there are people asking many of the same questions over and over. So the first thing you should think of when you notice that is not, oh, well, let's collect this and put this somewhere so everyone can find the answers much easier. You should instead be asking yourself, could we make this question redundant? Could we make it so people don't have to ask this question? Could we change a default somehow? Could we change the interface? Could we add better documentation that people will see? If there's nothing you can do, then yes, collecting them in a document of frequently asked questions, that's fine. It's good. It's a good thing to do. But always question, is there a way that you could make the process easier, rather than saying, well, this is the process, let's codify it. And finally, there's ideas to work on things like quick start guides. So this is the sort of thing that you might be tempted to say, well, let's just put all the information in the README, because people read the README, and that means they can just go back and refer to it anytime. It's in one central place, easy to find. The problem is that you end up getting something that is just getting longer and longer and longer, and getting all these niche pieces of information that most people may not actually need. So you can start moving that into separate guides. And a quick start guide can often be used for the common cases. But if there's a lot of information there, it's good to get it out of like the README and into the place for just the people that want to get a quick start developing, for example. So an example of the release notes I talked about, this is for the Rust language, and they release every 6 weeks. And they just specify, like, these are the things which we think are most interesting to people who would be using this new release of the language. These are the things that would probably affect people who are using the language and might end up breaking their programs. Very straightforward list, but it's written in a way that's meant to be accessible to people outside of that core team that are making the changes. And that's the important focus. So you may be seeing a theme here, and that is that there's going to be a lot of information, and especially if you're doing your job well and documenting it all, that's great. But the important point for new contributors is that you really need to walk a very fine line of giving them only as much information as is actually necessary to be effective without overloading them and overwhelming them with the amount of information, because that is the sort of thing that turns people off. And that makes them question whether this is actually an effective use of their time and whether they're actually cut out for this. Because the more things you look at when you're starting off and you go, That looks like I might need to learn a lot of things. I'm okay at learning things, but that's a lot of things. So, if you've ever looked at a bug tracker for an open source project, you probably are aware that they're not often organized the best. They're not often, they're playgrounds for the maintainers of the project to put down their ideas. And often, when we say things like, well, oh, it's an open source project, patches accepted to fix this problem you just reported. Or we say, oh, you want to contribute, that's great. We document everything in our bug tracker that you could work on. Just go find something there, have fun. That's no good. Let me show you what Mozilla's bug tracker looks like. This is the default view. If you click on the big Firefox logo on the front page, and then you say, oh, I'm interested in developer tools. Let's see what's open there. And you get this list, which is full of jargon and full of things that don't mean anything, and is full of all these columns and these numbers. And last year we got 161,000 new bugs filed in all across our bug database, and it's a really terrible experience for someone who's really keen. This is what you get if you actually click on one of those bugs. As a new contributor, you're like, oh, well, I'm going to read what this is about. I'm going to learn. I'm going to understand it. And then you're like, what is all this text? What does this mean? There's all these fields. There's not even a description of, you have to scroll down past all of this introductory metadata. Don't do this to your new contributors. I'm telling you, it is a losing strategy. We're going to find ways to make this better. So let's figure out how to solve the bug tracker problem for new contributors. First off, you need to get your bug tracker in order. You've got to start organizing it and categorizing it. So you can use things like, is this related to a certain piece of the code or the project? Let's give it a tag. Is there a certain symptom of a kind of problem that this exhibits? Is it a crash? Is it something that is, can be reported by another tool or a style checker or something? Common symptom, let's tag it. Does this require a certain platform to reproduce or to work on? Let's tag it. Does this require a certain skill? If your project uses more than one programming language, maybe it's got part of it written in C++, part of it written in Python, for example. Maybe you have some scripts or some tools. Tag those. The ones to work on Python issues, you're going to tag them with a Python label. The ones for C++, tag them with a C++ label. This allows people using your bug tracker to say, well, I don't know C++. I'm just going to look at the ones that require Python. And also, I only have a Mac, so I'm only going to look at the ones that say they require, Mac to work on. This allows you to reduce the information. That's really important. Next up, we're going to start tagging things based on whether they're appropriate for someone either on the core team to work on, they require lots of specialized domain knowledge, or maybe they could be worked on by anybody. As long as you know how to write a line of Python, well, you can probably work on this one. We welcome you. This is a great way to get an introduction to the project. So many projects are now using labels. They're easy or good first PR or newcomers welcome or newcomers only or something to indicate that this particular issue and anything else tagged with this issue or with this label is good for that class of contributor. And you can usually have several steps here. You can have the easy ones. You can have the ones which are maybe a bit harder. Maybe they're good for a second step after the first one, or maybe if you're feeling really confident, then you can just dive right into those ones. It allows people to reduce the information and find something that's relevant to themselves. And I use the word appropriate here because there are things that are inappropriate for newcomers to work on. So, for example, something that requires specialized knowledge or prior knowledge of the project. Maybe not so great for newcomers to the project. Or if there's something where, someone files it and they're like, oh, I bet this would be a good idea. I bet someone could work on it. And they forget about it and someone tries to, and it turns out it's not actually a good idea. The contributors spent, hours, days working on this thing, and the reviewers are like, that didn't work out. All right, thanks for the effort. That's a very sad situation. Things that are appropriate are things that are wanted, work that is desired by the rest of the team. Yes. Similarly, you can have things which don't actually fit that criteria, but as long as there's someone who knows how it should be solved, or has an idea of how to solve it, and believes that's the right idea, Like, that's good to tag. That means someone has put thought into it, and there's structure in there that suggests how to solve it. That means someone could attempt it with proper guidance. And that's great. That's mentorship. So, what do we do next? We've got tags for areas of things and skills, ways of categorizing them. We've got tags for who this is appropriate for. That's good. Now we need to make sure that our issues are actually actionable right from the start. Because if you're keen to work on a project, and you see, oh, they've even got things that are tagged as being good for newcomers. This is great. They're ready for me. And then you go into it and you read it and you're like, they're using these words that I don't understand. They just say, we should remove all the foo bars in this thing. And we're like, I don't know what a foo bar is. I don't know where the foo bars are. I don't know how to find foo bars. Maybe this isn't for me. That's assuming a certain level of basic, of prior knowledge which may not be present. So, issues should have everything in them already written up to be complete, to allow someone to work on it independently from the start without having to wait for more information. That would be the ideal to aim for. Because every time someone has to wait for more information, that is a chance to lose them. That's a chance for them to say, I feel uncomfortable, especially if this is tagged as something like, good first PR or easy. That suggests that they're just not up to snuff, rather than the person who filed the issue didn't put in enough information to make it actually actionable. These are things that can be avoided with enough diligence on the part of issue filers. You should have the exact steps to reproduce an issue if that's relevant. You should have links to file names and class names and function names, like the things that will allow people to search the code and make changes. Links to documentation, explain how to run tests that are relevant. So here's an example of one for Servo. We've got a title which wouldn't necessarily mean anything to someone, but we've got a pretty good reputation now for being able to write issues that people will at least click through and try reading them first before giving up. So we say, all right, we have a file name here, and this is a fairly straightforward class of refactoring here, we say, and it's marked as easy. And it says, go into this file. If you remove this function, then you should just be able to replace any users that would show up when you try to build again with this other thing which does the same thing. It sounds fairly straightforward. And I'll tell you, in Servo, these get snapped up literally within hours because we've got a community of people that are always looking out for stuff like this. So, the step after this. You've got issues which are actionable. That's great. Now, the problem can actually turn into, what if people show up and you have multiple people that want to work on the same thing? You need to make sure that there is a way of saying, this issue has already been claimed, you'll need to find something else to work on, and in a way that doesn't end up invalidating someone else's work. So, for our Mozilla bug tracker, for example, we can use the assign field, that's great. In GitHub, it doesn't allow you to assign to people that are outside of your organization or your team, so we just have a little label. And that allows people to easily see, oh, this is marked as assigned, I can skip it. That's fine. And this is also an interesting issue that was filed, which is marked as less easy. So it's not intended necessarily for someone taking their first steps contributing to Servo, but it's something which, when I filed it, I said, all right, I'm pretty sure I know the steps involved to solve this. So here's the code that needs changing. Here are the steps in my mind that I'm thinking, and I looked at the code while writing this, and I'm pretty sure this should be enough to solve it. And this was claimed within, I think, 2 days. And there's now a pull request to actually fix that. So, final step for making your bug tracker better. You need to triage things. Because it's really frustrating when you have an issue that contains everything that needs to be acted upon, and it's marked as being good for beginners, and someone shows up and they're like, yes, I can do this. I have all the skills required. This issue makes sense to me. And they go looking and they're like, the file mentioned doesn't exist anymore. Now what? And all that enthusiasm just disappears right there because they have to wait for more updates. So if you make it part of your process to actually go through, you triage things, you say, is this actually still valid? Can we still reproduce this? If someone said they're working on it, are they actually still working on it? Have they gone dormant? Check in with them. And is this actually still good for a newcomer? Because sometimes you have something, you file it, you're like, oh, I'm pretty sure I know what the solution is, I'll write it down. And then someone tries it, and something happens, and they give up. So another person comes along and they're like, oh, it's not assigned, I'll take it. They try it, maybe they disappear. Someone else comes along, They try it, doesn't work. Suddenly, you've got this long chain of comments of people saying like, yes, I'm going to work on this, and maybe there's questions in there, and it doesn't look approachable anymore. Or maybe it actually is harder than you thought, and maybe it's not actually appropriate for a brand new newcomer. And that's okay, you can change these things. But it's important to just stay on top of the ball and make sure you are keeping the status of these things correctly. Because that first impression is so important. It's when people first see your project, and there's always that sense of, am I good enough for this project? I'm interested. That's why I'm attempting to contribute. I want to get something out of it, but if it doesn't give back, there's no reason to stick around. So, we prioritize useful information. Let's talk about friction. Friction, in the context of an open source project, are all the things that can go wrong when you're a new contributor. It's the things that happen that are out of your control. You follow instructions, and something doesn't work. Has anyone ever tried to set up a project that had a list of, like, you need to install these things, or you need to just run this compile command, and it'll just work? And something doesn't compile. A flag is wrong. You're missing a dependency. Something that feels like I followed the instructions, and I can't do anything without asking someone else. And that's really disheartening. Similarly, if your project says using a Mac, that's great. You can either use Homebrew or Mac ports in order to install your prerequisite libraries. To someone who doesn't know what either Mac ports or Homebrew is, they now have to make a choice, and they don't have any reason to choose one over the other, but they have to. This is disheartening. This is intimidating. What if you make the wrong choice? Who knows? These are things you should try to eliminate. This is friction. Anytime you have to ask to wait for someone, or anytime you have to ask someone for something and you need to wait on them and you don't know how long. Risky business there. There is research showing that the first 24 hours after a first contribution is so important, because after that 24 hours, if there's been no contact with anyone on the receiving end there, the chances of a repeated contribution after that point go way down. It's that initial window that needs to set expectations properly. Similarly, if you, every time you're trying to contribute to a project and there's some skill you don't have that it says you need, that's a piece of friction. You might end up with someone who is really keen to learn new things, and that's great. But every time you have something which is different than the norm, different than their prior experiences, you have a chance of losing them. And every time someone does something for your project and you throw it away, that is friction. That is saying, you did stuff for us, but we don't value it. That is something that needs to be avoided. So the ways we can do that are build tools that understand failure and suggest ways to fix it. So whether it's, instead of a list of shell commands to run to install things, you write a script that does that instead, that can watch for any errors that occur and print out a message saying, hey, why don't you email our mailing list with the output from this thing? Or even suggests, or even tries to fix it itself. There are ways to avoid, or to make the failure case less disturbing and disheartening. And similarly, anytime you have a choice between one piece of technology which already exists in your project and therefore requires skills that already exist in your project, and another one which would require different skills, try to standardize on the things you already use rather than just introducing another thing. Because you need to weigh the risks of requiring additional skill sets versus being able to make do with the existing ones. So as an example of setting expectations properly, I built a bot for GitHub which will watch for new pull requests from new contributors, someone who has never contributed before. And if there is one, the first thing they see is a message from this bot that says, thank you, we're going to look at it soon. We really are excited to review your changes. And then it also pings someone in the core team to make sure that even if somehow we totally overlook this pull request, someone's going to get an email who is ostensibly on the core team and will respond to this. It's a way to avoid overlooking these things. Similarly, if you have an IRC channel, some sort of chat room, you can have a bot which will look for someone new that shows up, asks a question, and doesn't get a response in 15 minutes or something, and says, hey, it looks like everyone's busy. Why don't you try emailing our mailing list or something? These are tools we can build to avoid these problems. So let's talk about expectations. Expectations are very important because you can do things that would usually be bad practices, like not respond for a long time, as long as you set it up ahead of time so people know what to expect. So if in your contributing thing you say, well, we're all pretty busy, we're volunteers, so we expect we'll review any new contributions within a week of them arriving. That's just the way it works. And people will be like, all right, thanks for telling me. So you can say how difficult something is. You can say I expect this to be a hard project, but for someone who wants to take that on, I'm willing to help you. Rather than saying, this is a really exciting project, I'm willing to help you, and people show up and be like, yes, this sounds really exciting, and then they don't have any idea of how hard it actually will be. If there's a deadline on something, you should make that clear, because it really sucks if someone is working on something, and then you're like, sorry, too late, we needed this yesterday, so I did it. That's not valuing their time. And additionally, if there is a certain standard of behavior you want for your project community, code of conduct, that's the way to go about it. You lay out your expectations, you say, this is the way people in this community are going to behave. If they don't, then yes, we will exclude them from the community. And that sets expectations. That allows people to know what is expected of them. So as an example, as I mentioned, there was one time when I was on vacation and I'd get emails when things appeared on GitHub. Someone submitted a pull request to one of my projects. So I decided, all right, I'll write a little message saying, I can't do this now, but please let me know if I forget about this by the time I should have done it. It's great. People understand that. People appreciate communication, it turns out. So, expectations, great. Now, let's talk about responding and responding appropriately to things. So, as I said, research 24 hours after a first contribution shows that you really need to minimize that time. And it's okay to set up expectations to do differently as long as those are there. So for changes you get that don't meet a certain minimum bar of quality, if you're working with a contributor and making suggestions for how to improve their changes and they're just not getting it over and over, and you feel this is no longer a valuable use of my time to continue doing this, then yeah, it's okay to take their changes, make the fixes you want yourself, and say, all right, thanks. Thanks for your contribution. I acknowledge the time you spent on it. It's really helpful. I made these following changes. Take a look and see what you think of them. And just merge them in yourself, close that pull request or that bug, whatever. That's a way to gracefully acknowledge that some contributions are not quite enough, but acknowledging that time was spent on them and that time is valuable. Additionally, if someone makes a change that is not actually one you want to accept, period, it's outside the scope of the project, then it's okay to say that. But it's even better to state that up front in your roadmap somewhere else and make it clear from the get-go so that people don't feel blindsided by this after putting time into it. So there are certain hacks you can do with communicating with people to make the process better too. One thing I really like for reviewing code is I write out a comment about someone's code. I say, oh, this line, I think that you could do it more efficiently this way or something. And then every single time, right before I publish, I go through and I do a complete global find and replace of you with we, and your with our. And it's amazing what a difference it makes, because it suddenly turns something that is almost confrontational, saying your code is not good enough, you should make this change, you should do it more efficiently. And instead it says, this is a shared project, this is our code, I think together we could do something more efficiently this way. And it just changes the whole tone of the conversation. Saying thank you, super important. Always do that. Acknowledging contribution is very, very important. So, after the appropriate response, we've got the follow-through. Let's talk about what that means. So, as I said, recognition of contribution. Not just saying thank you to someone for their contribution. That's really important, that's good. But the systems that we've talked about so far have set up a really, really good mechanism for getting many sets of first contributions to your project. But they don't necessarily set us up for second contributions or repeated ones. So there's a way to do that. And the way to do that is when someone makes a contribution, they're already invested. You can capitalize on that. You can say, thanks for your contribution. If you'd like a suggestion for something else you could work on, I'd be happy to help with that. That's great. It gives them the opportunity to decline, or it gives them the opportunity to say, yeah, I'm really interested in continuing, and I don't necessarily know what to do next. And as a maintainer, every person who contributes is a possible future maintainer. You should nurture that. You should look at it, and you should say, okay, what have they worked on? What skills have they learned? What could we help develop? Is there an area of the code that they now have more experience with that they could continue working on? Are there things that we have previously filed, which are categorized for that same area, where you can use all of these skills we've built so far, and we can say, hey, why don't you work on this other thing that's related? And that gives them a stepping stone to get better and better. These are the ways to develop positive relationships with contributors, valuing their time, and pointing out that you understand the skills that they're gaining through this, and that you would like to help develop almost a mentorship. That is what successful development of repeat contributions looks like. It's saying, I understand the value that you bring to this organization, this team, this project, and I would like to help you maximize that. So, altogether, we have now helped people get involved quickly, and we've helped them have a positive experience by following all the previous steps. However, we now need to market our project. So, how do we actually find people to look at the issues we filed? So, there's a feedback cycle. If you start getting people contributing to your project, word gets out if they have positive experiences or negative ones. There is a whisper network of people saying, hey, I really enjoyed working on this thing. I'll tell my friends about it. I'll tell this university class about it. Like, this is how word spreads if you have a really positive and valuable experience contributing. There's also tools for getting these pieces of work out into the eyes of people that might be able to do them. For example, there's a site called issuehub.io, which allows you to say, well, I'm interested in any issues that require this language. And you can say, oh, okay, I'm looking for anything, like I want to work on documentation for a GitHub project that requires this language. And then it'll show you like all of the issues filed with the documentation tag that are in projects for that language. Or you might be like, well, anything that's marked as beginner, that sounds like me. And I want to do Ruby or JavaScript. This is really convenient. It just shows up there automatically if you have the right tags on GitHub. Similarly, Firefox has a Twitter account called Start Mozilla, which is used to take our bugs which are marked as being good for beginners, often, and giving a really brief description to get people interested, and link to them. And last I heard, like often these were being claimed within like a day or two of posting these, because we've got an audience of like more than 1,000 people that are just watching the Twitter feed, and they just come through. It's great. Similarly, there's another one called Your First PR, which is written by someone who really likes helping people get started in open source projects. And so they started curating these lists of issues for projects, looking for the ones which have all the information required, which don't require specialized domain knowledge. And every day they post a new one that says, hey, you could contribute to this project, which requires these skills. There's another website called Up for Grabs, which basically, if you submit your project there, there's instructions at the very bottom of the page. Then it'll appear on this big list of projects which claim that they would like new contributors, and they have issues which are marked as available for new contributors. That's great. And for Firefox, as I showed earlier, our bug tracker is not newcomer friendly. So I wrote an alternative view, which would only find issues which are marked as having a mentor. And in particular, you can also say, I only want ones which are good for beginners. And that's the display only simple bugs. That's what that filters. And you can say, I'm only interested in things that require like networking knowledge, or like working in the networking code and stuff with accessibility. And you can also filter by, I only know C++ or JavaScript. This is a way of reducing the information and making it into a much more relevant view for newcomers. That's less intimidating. I also wrote a site called whatcanido4mozilla.org, which is another way of looking at it. People would sometimes come to me, and they wouldn't necessarily want to be given just any task that was available. They'd want to say, what team can I join? I know these languages. So I built a site which will allow you to filter down by what your skills are, and then say, oh, these teams are looking for people with those skills, and these have links to getting involved with those particular teams instead. So those are specific tools for publicizing the work that's available. You can also do things like go to tech talks, or like give tech talks at meetups that are related to the skills you need. But the important thing here is when you find a potential audience, or when you find an audience of potential contributors, the really important thing is pitching your project in the right way. It's not enough to just say, you know, this is a JavaScript this is a project that uses JavaScript and it does like shared collaborative editing or something. We're open source. You should help us. Because that doesn't actually, that's addressing it from the maintainer's viewpoint, saying these are the skills that people need in order to join us. But it's not actually providing a good reason for someone else to say, oh, that sounds like something I could help with. Pitching the project requires saying, like, what are they going to get out of this experience? Why would they want to contribute? Are they going to be able to develop a skill by contributing? Are they going to be able to learn about something new that they don't know about yet? Or are they going to be able to make use of something which might be a bit niche, but they're actually really good at or excited by? So finding the right way to describe your project to people and describe why it would actually be a valuable experience for them to spend their time contributing to your project is the key takeaway here. So that's it. You've now learned the steps required in order to make your project accessible and interesting and reduce the bounce rate of people showing up and be like, whoa, this looks like something I don't know how to do, can't learn how to do, and turn it into something which originally might have looked like a mountain, but now is actually a water slide, and they can just shoot right down. So thank you. I'd love to hear if any questions you have. Yes, Mackie.
You are the model of a person who wants to bring on new contributors, and I salute that. My question is, how do you build in an incentive for the, if you will, hard-nosed core contributors to want to do this, where in some communities they really don't?
That's a really good question. And the question was, how do you build in an incentive for the people who are part of the core team to actually want to bring in new contributors and put in this effort? Because yes, it is effort. This is actually taking away from time you could spend writing code, and you're putting it towards this wishy-washy idea of having other people write code instead. Which, I mean, some people like to refer to that as a force multiplier. And using that analogy, you could say, like, as a core maintainer of a project, like, it depends on what you want to do. If you focus on, me personally, I have these skills, I'm going to use these skills to advance this project, and that is my tunnel vision. Like, that is an okay viewpoint to have, but I argue, if you have people who are thinking about the longer term goals of the project and saying, this is where we want to be, these are the things we need to do to get there, you can look at it and say, well, it may take us like 2 years in order to get there if we do these things by ourselves. But if we could find X many other people to help us do these things, think how much less time that could take, how much more things we could accomplish that way. So, I mean, being a model of bringing in new contributors and showing what outside contributors can do for your project, that's a fine way to demonstrate that and like be a role model for the other people in your team. That's one way. But yeah, making the pragmatic argument that like there's all this stuff that like we need to do, and there's only so many of us and so much time. Like that's, I think to me that's a compelling argument of why it's worth putting in this investment. Yes.
Doing projects, maybe there's a lot of examples, but very successful, large, well-used open source projects where there's only, say, less than a dozen actual core contributors, and then just hundreds or thousands of, like, is there a way to get a huge community of support developers with a very small core team and somehow manage that process? Does that exist?
That's a good question. And the question was, are there examples of models where you have a really small core team with a much larger, wider sort of community of support developers and people who are not necessarily contributing like regularly or continuously, but are there to like get things done, right? So, I mean, one of these, the other part of the question was like, is there a model to show that like this can actually be done effectively? I believe. So personally, I think the project I mentioned earlier, Servo, which is developing a brand new web browser. Written in a new programming language, where we have 7 full-time employees, I believe. We've got over 300 non-employee contributors who have contributed in the past 2.5 years, I believe. And the majority of those have been in the past 1.5 years. It certainly takes effort to manage that, but getting onto a model, Getting to a model where people file issues proactively, where they have an idea of something that could be done, and instead of like writing it down somewhere and saying, oh, this is on my to-do list, if you put it out there, you describe what you want done, mark it in appropriate ways, that can give people ideas for things to work on. And that's certainly a model that we follow in Servo. For other projects with similar success stories, I would argue that there's certainly been a very long period of time where that's been true for Firefox, where there was a fairly comparatively small core team and much larger sort of army of volunteers who would do occasional contribution or infrequent contribution. But yeah, certainly managing that is challenging. And I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all strategy for that right now. Yes, you in the back.
When people use the a lot of different Git type related projects, everyone has their own sort of way of having a development thing. You know, we have a development branch, we have this branch, and this is how we develop on this. But then the person next person coming in, they're used to a different way. So what's any advice or anything that you think that one way works better than the other, or is it standardized?
Really, I mean, when possible, as a project maintainer, you should adhere to existing practices. So if you're starting a new project, then if you care more about being efficient in your own model, then that's fine. And codifying that in a document saying this is the recommended, supported way of developing this project, like that's fine. Setting expectations, like I said. But similarly, looking at what people do already and trying to go with the most common way of doing that, like that's usually going to be the path of least resistance. If someone comes in and refuses to work in that model, I mean, you have 2 options. One is, like, if the models are incompatible and you cannot actually accept contributions from them if they can continue doing that, like, you don't really have a choice unless you choose to change your practices to accommodate that. But really, like saying, we recommend doing it this way and we can answer questions about doing it this way seems like it's fine to me. Do you have a question?
With the open source community growing every day, how do you think the proportion between the maintainers and the contributors will change in the next, let's say, 10 to 20 years? Is there going to be a lack of contributors for a specific number of projects? Is that where you're going to head then?
So the question was, as the open source community is growing rapidly these days, do we foresee a sort of imbalance between the number of maintainers in the future and the number of contributors? With the idea being that there wouldn't be enough contributors to different projects, or would it be the reverse, that there'd be not enough maintainers for projects? Not enough contributors to projects. It's unclear. I think both of those models are problematic. I think for the maintainer one, it sort of depends how people look at this, because I am a strong advocate for giving contributors privileges as soon as possible, as soon as it makes sense to do so. It's difficult to make changes in an open source project that are totally irrevocable. And And therefore, giving someone commit access to your project is a way of bringing them in and saying, hey, I trust you to make changes, and I also trust you to ask me if there's things that you're unsure about, rather than keeping people at arm's length and saying, well, I am the only gatekeeper here, and therefore making everything pass through yourself. Like, that is a form of limitation of your project, and it's a limitation of the resources that could be available to you. Because people with more privileges will feel more involved and will feel stronger about maintaining the project. Like, maintainers don't have to be like absolute core developers that are there setting the goals and deciding the future. They can be people who perform very useful tasks for your project. They can be the people that do triage regularly, the people that do documentation for your project. They can be people that localize things and translate them. They can be people that are not even technical, but have a good idea, but have a good sense of how to work with the community, how to work with people, communicate. I think maintainership can be a larger role than many people really give credence to. And when it comes to a lack of contributors, it's hard to say whether that's really a problem. I think people who are already in the open source community, it's easier for them to be contributors to other projects because they've got the experience. People coming in from the outside, that number seems to be continuously growing as we're doing more outreach. It doesn't seem like that'll really be a realistic problem to me. Yeah, Hugh.
You have, if you open doors wide and let lots of people contribute, which I think is a great idea, how do you prevent uncontrolled growth of the code? And not the capabilities, I'm talking about the size of the code, the balance of code size versus what it's accomplishing.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, one of the important things in my mind, elegance of code, is simplicity and clarity and minimality. And that, how can you do that with a crowd?
It's a good question. And the question was, if you open the doors wide and let in all sorts of changes, or at least the possibility of all sorts of changes, how do you manage sort of the growth of code from a very technical standpoint, just getting more and more code if it becomes less elegant, less maintainable as a result? How do you manage that with a larger crowd of contributors? And to me, I found a really interesting thing with the Servo project in particular, is that I have taught myself that anytime I notice something in the code that looks like it could be improved in a way that I can describe, instead of doing it myself, I file an issue, I mark it as refactoring, and it's probably good for a newcomer, and I describe what I want the outcome to be. And then I go off and forget about it. And a couple days later, there's a pull request to fix it. And that's a really effective way to manage changes to code that it's like weeding the garden. It allows people who don't have that inside knowledge of the code base already to just come in and do very focused, specific improvements to keep it maintainable. I think, personally, to me, that seems like the most workable system when numbers increase. But yeah, that takes self-discipline. I know a lot of people who they see something in the code, they're like, all right, I can fix that. I know how to do that. But as a maintainer, I feel if you have the knowledge to do more complex things, I think it's worth using that knowledge and focusing on the more complex things and leaving the stuff that doesn't require that background knowledge to people that can make better use of it. Yeah?
Yeah. Now, if I wanted to start a project and maybe considering to invite contributors later on, would you advise that I start working on it maybe in my office, back home, maybe for some time, and then I bring people on board? And that's one question. Question number two is, how do you describe the requirements for hosting?
Okay, there were two questions there. First one was, if I was going to start my own project and invite other people to contribute to it, would you recommend that I start working on it by myself in my own office before sharing it with the world? And second question, what
The hosting requirements, because I imagine that you will require a website.
Right.
And you need to engage the contributors, one of the questions there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the second question was about hosting requirements. So addressing the first one, I would say, personally, I am a fan of release early, release often. So I personally have no shame about releasing my code into the wild. I have released so many pieces of code which are entirely half-baked, And I've described what my vision for them is, with the hopes that anyone else might come along and see it and share that vision. And actually, one of the websites that I showed there, I released very early. It was very ugly as a web page. It was what can I do for Mozilla.org. It was strictly text-based with really awful little oval buttons. And then, because I released it and shared it around, I got a contribution from someone who was a designer who said, hey, I can make this better. And he added like gradients and backgrounds and pictures and colors. It was great. So personally, I think getting over that fear that you might release something which isn't good enough is really important to work on managing. And I think sharing early is important. As for the second question about hosting requirements, whether it's good to have a website where, how important that is, I think having a web presence is a great way to be an invitation for people to take part and have that information up front about what your goals are, etc. And I think there are tools like GitHub Pages where it's fairly straightforward these days to actually set up a web presence without too much effort or domain knowledge. So I think that's pretty important. One last question, I guess?
I really like many of the prescriptions that you have in your presentation on how to build an accessible open source community. But I do feel that Mozilla and Red Hat, two of the biggest open source communities out there, don't necessarily follow a lot of what you suggest. And some of that is just because they're older institutions and they've evolved for a long time. Am I being too much of a pessimist in thinking that they're too big to change now? I feel that both Mozilla and Red Hat benefit a lot from student developers, and which is great because that's a great way of getting people involved. But then most of the students tend to fall away from the tree eventually and not get back into it. Do you feel the two communities are of the past era, or can they change and still save themselves?
That's an interesting question. And the question was, are there projects which are too big and too established to be able to actually change to follow the techniques that I described in this talk? It's very interesting because I have actually been working on instituting these especially in Firefox in particular over the past 4 years. That's when I really started getting interested in this and started developing these techniques. I think as a whole, it can be difficult to talk about organizations like that. I think breaking them down into actual individual projects is much easier to talk about, can we get enough leverage in this project to change the way they're operating and encourage these better techniques? I think certainly for new projects inside these organizations, it's much easier to do so. For more established ones, like Firefox, for example, inside Mozilla, it's very difficult because there's such a diverse set of contributors that it's difficult to actually reach them all and share the motivation behind these changes that we're suggesting. Certainly, I think it is possible for projects to get stuck in a rut and not be able to follow these effectively. I think avoiding that requires getting enough mind share of the people who are strongly invested in that and can make the changes themselves to just eventually get enough developers in the ranks that do follow these practices that you have something approaching these best practices. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, for sure. Good discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.